So the first thing I want to teach you about acrylic paint is that just because it's a thick paint doesn't mean that it is going to be a solid paint. Some of these paints are transparent and some of them are semi-transparent, semi-opaque, and opaque. And you can figure out, there's these little symbols on the next to the label somewhere on your bottle, and it's a little square, and I've written them down here for you. So when you see just an empty square, it means transparent. So this blue, ultramarine blue, what that means is that if I paint over this line here, so I just have a black solid line, if I paint over it, I can see the line through it. Okay, so I can still see the line. I don't have a semi-transparent, but it just means that it's a little harder to see that line, but we can still, it's still see-through. My yellow and my Indian orange are a semi-opaque. So if I look at those, the symbols on that, it has the triangle with half of it filled. And so when I'm painting it, the line is not as, it's a little bit cloudy, where the line is very visible through it. Okay. And then the opaque, that is our red, my crimson red. It's a solid square, so my crimson red has that solid square there. So that means this is very opaque. Our white will be very opaque. And that means when you paint over it, it'll cover your line mostly. These are cheaper paints, so they're going to be a little bit see-through regardless. The general rule for art is the more money you spend on paints, the more pigment, or the more like the powder that they use to create the color, the more of it is in there, so the colors are richer and you won't run into so much transparency when you're painting with a higher quality paint. The next thing I want to talk to you real quick about are brushes. There's different brushes, right? So I have these different brushes. This brush is a watercolor brush, and see how like it smashes. It's really soft. It kind of looks like and feels like a makeup brush. It's very soft. It's very pliable. These brushes, they don't flare out as much. So like that flares out. This doesn't, right? And this one's that same brush. I'm not going to use that one because it's wet. This one, the hair is a little bit like rough, and it also doesn't really flail out too much. This one with the rougher bristles are mostly for oil paints, but you can use it for acrylic. I don't really like using it because it gives me too much texture. I personally like smoother paintings, so that's a preference for you. So you definitely want one more like this, where it can still keep its point when you lift back up, but kind of lay flat a little bit. This brush, only for watercolor. You don't want to use that kind of brush. There are this is called a round brush. And then we have some flat brushes here. And I personally like the angled flat brush because it kind of gives you a little point to work with, but then you can also work flat. You can work and do some line work this way. So this is a very versatile brush to use. So you'll probably see me use this one a lot today. And what we're going to do is just create, we're going to just do a simple apple. have a little leaf here. Give me a better view of that apple. Okay, so before I start, if you press really hard with your pencil, you might want to take your kneaded eraser, if you have one, and just lighten it up. Or just with your regular eraser, you can just lightly erase a little bit, just to lighten up that value and to pick up any residue of any graphite, because any of the lead, especially with the color yellow that we're using, it'll pick up that paint and it'll dirty the color. So you don't want to have that happen. The rule with acrylic painting is usually you start with your lightest colors first. And sometimes, and you usually start with your background and move forward. And that's really a preference. But the light colors to darker colors, that's a definite. So I'm going to pretend like my light source is over here to the right. So I'm going to have a brighter area. And apples have multiple colors in them. They're not just solid red. So I'm going to grab some of my yellow here. I can water this down a bit. So I'm just grabbing a little bit of it and I'm adding water to it so it's a little bit thinner. And then I can start to put in my yellow. I can put it in everywhere. I'm going to just give myself a solid base of yellow just to add some consistency through this. And I'm going to keep it kind of watered down, like a little bit like a watercolor. And there's my kitty in the background. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rinse my brush. And I'm just going to have just water so that I can lighten up this yellow all the way to the edge. And I'm going to try to push back some of this paint. So I'm going to just clean my brush again, add water, I'm going to push that yellow back so that I have a little bit more of that highlight. Okay. The great thing about acrylic paint is that it dries very, very quickly. So you can either you can wait till layer dries and then you can paint over it, or you can keep painting while it's wet. I like to try to keep painting while it's wet. On canvas, it's a little bit easier to do that. On paper, it's drying pretty quickly. So you just have to learn the tricks to manipulate it. So I'm going to go ahead and grab just some orange here. And I'm going to start in the middle. And I'm just going to do some streaks of orange because, again, our apples tend to be multicolored. And I'm going to get some water on my brush and water down that paint just a little bit more so that I have more of a watered down version. I need more water. I notice my paintbrush strokes are kind of rounded, like they're following the curve, and then as I'm in the center a little bit straight, and then they start to curve the other way. That is so I can start molding the shape of my apple to make it look round. So I'm going to rinse out my brush, and I'm going to grab some red now. Now I'm getting to the lighter area, so I'm going to rinse my brush out a little bit, add water. What I'm doing is just kind of getting this watered out a bit. So that I have a little bit lighter of a red. Now, because I'm using red, if you notice, I don't have any black on my palette. And that's because black really just kills a color. It really deadens it. So I'm going to take just a little bit of my green, and I might mix it into my red here that I watered down, just to give myself a little bit more of a natural color of a brown. And I can start putting in some of that where I want the shadow. And this gives me a little bit more of a natural color for my shadow. I can go straight with green too. So I can add just pure green at the bottom here. Because it's still wet, it's kind of mixing in with my colors. I don't want too much to the left over here, but I want a little bit on the bottom here because the light's going to hit on the top. So a little bit lighter. Actually, no. I clean my brush. Just dampen the tip of it a little bit. I'm going to grab some pure red for this back area here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a little bit of that green, and I'm going to put that here at the bottom. So I have that green line there, and so I've cleaned my brush. I'm going to dab it so it's a little dry, and I'm going to just take this brush and I'm going to push my red into that green so that it kind of blends and fades it out. And that's going to give me that little shadow where the stem comes from. I'm going to let that dry a little bit. For the stem, I'm going to also put some of that watered down yellow because when you're painting, you want there to be a consistency, and like you want the colors to have something in common. So sometimes laying down a little bit of one main color. So this whole apple, including its leaf and its branch, will have a little bit of yellow in it. Will that yellow show all the way through? Not necessarily, but it gives it a lot of like color harmony, which means they're all kind of related to one another. So now I'm going to take some of that red and that green that I mixed together, and I'm going to use that as my stem color. I'm going to let that dry a little bit. So what I'm doing is I'm waiting for the apple to dry, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over with a little bit more red. So I'm going to bring that red back out. While we're waiting on that, I'm going to go ahead and give myself a background. Since since I put some blue down for the demonstration, I'll go ahead and give us maybe a blue background, just to keep it simple. I'm actually going to switch brushes. So I'm using that angled brush. You can paint a lot thicker than what I'm doing here. I'm just not, I personally am not one to paint very thick. I prefer the smoother look. And I also prefer watercolor. So I like watering down my acrylics and letting it fade to become watercolor. Zoom out so you can see that. Sorry. So I'm just taking water and I'm just kind of going crazy here so that it's more translucent. Notice a lot of my brush strokes are going in the same direction because once it's translucent, or even at like the cheaper acrylics, you'll see your brush strokes in it. So you always want to try to keep your brush strokes pretty consistent to hide those if you're one like me who wants things to be a little bit smoother. If you like the texture, then try to keep your brush strokes very similar, or have like 2 or 3 different brush strokes. You don't want there to be too much difference, otherwise it gets too chaotic. So definitely try to keep your brush strokes the same. And what I mean by that is that they're going in similar directions. So all my brush strokes are kind of like following around this. And as long as I keep that, oops. Good thing I'm not done with that leaf. Okay. I'm going to go back to my red, and I want to get some more red over here. So now when I go over this, because this is a cheaper paint, my red goes over my greens here, and it's going to make it a little bit more vibrant, and I'm going to see the shadow through it. And part of that is also because I've watered this down. So I can get this to be a lot more intense of a red if I want. And I'm just kind of evening out, lifting up some of the red here so that we can see my shadows still. And take some of my green here and start to work into my leaf. And grab just a little dab of red, and I'm going to put a little bit of shadow here on the inside. Because the green is wet, it's going to mix with that, so I'm going to rinse my brush, maybe grab a little bit of green. I can make that more of a shadow. And then to make a better, or maybe a more, not a better black, but a black that isn't going to kind of kill your painting, you can take, usually take your red with a little bit of blue, and a little bit of green. And you just have to play with the quantities. It's to get to the color you want. So that's still pretty red. So I'm going to need some more blue. I'm just going to grab some green here. Right now I have a good brown. It needs more blue. Get a little bit more blue. So it's a little bit, it's gotten darker. It's almost like a really dark gray, which is perfect. Because I'm going to use that for my shadow here. And this is going to, it'll look black, but it's not entirely black. If I spread it out, you'll see, if I were to spread it out a bit, let's see, let me do this up over here where there's more light. It's more of a brown as I water it out, right? It's more of a brown, but when we're looking at it with the apple, it's looking a little bit more black. And so it's a little bit easier and nicer on the eyes. And it also fulfills like the color harmony because it has the red in it, which we have red in the apple. So those two colors are a little bit more closely related. And my shadow is really off, but this is more about the acrylic. Okay. And while it's still wet, you can kind of still activate it. That's once it's fully dry, it's set because it dries like a plastic. Yeah, so that kind of ends up being our apple. I think that should be helpful. Hopefully, if not, let me know and I'll play some more for another demo. I almost forgot to tell you what to do with leftover paint. So if you're not done painting, then what I would do is I would take a paper towel and fold it as small as you can, right? And then I would make sure to wet it so that it's dripping wet. So it needs a little bit more water. So it's dripping wet. And then I would set it somewhere on your plate. And then I would put a new sheet of saran wrap. And because there's saran wrap on here, you don't need that big of a piece to touch all of these pieces. And I would just touch the saran wrap to the ends. Don't push it in the middle, otherwise it's going to spread and mix all your paints. But this will keep it moist, and if your parents are not going to freak out, I would put it in the refrigerator to keep the paint moist and wet. This way, like the next day, if you go to paint, your paint should still be usable. Otherwise, if that's not an option for you, then just put very little amounts of paint so that you're not wasting it. And if you have paint, I would find something that you want to create as your own personal community canvas. So my friends and I, we have we have like 5 big canvases in my garage, and everybody knows if you have leftover paint, you add to the community canvas. And some people draw and some people don't. But essentially what we do is we just grab as much of the paint off of our palettes, kind of like this. And we just smear the paint on there. And it's kind of neat because then it gets all textured and it gets all, sometimes we see images in it. So like in this one, I might dab. And it's okay if they mix in some weird way because it doesn't matter, because someone else is going to just paint on top of it. And then you let it dry, and each time you paint, you just add to it, and you get to see, you get to see it change, and it just, it kind of becomes a neat little thing to watch change over time. So those are some options for your unused paint. Okay. See you soon, everyone. Stay safe and well. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, depending on when you see this. This demo is for those who requested an acrylic painting demo. So what I have here is I have saran wrap, and I'll show you what I'm going to do, use that for, and I have a paper plate. These two I'm going to use to create my mixing palette for those of you who don't have a mixing tray. If you don't have a paper plate, a white, like, ceramic plate, and it's best if it's white because then you can see the colors on it, and a ceramic plate because then you can peel the paint off of it when it dries. It's easier and clean up. And then I have paper underneath this that I'm going to use. The acrylic paint I'm going to use is Arteza. Let's see if you can see the name here without my lights on the other side. Let's do this. You get to see my messy desk. So this is Arteza. It's actually a pretty affordable brand. I think I paid $30 for 14. It comes in a little box of 14 of these little pouches of color, and this little pouch goes a really long way, because the great thing about acrylic paint is that you don't really need a lot, so when you're to paint much, so this lasts pretty well. I use this for my monthly paint nights with my friends. It's bright colors, it's cheap, and it works pretty well. So I do recommend it. If not, just whatever acrylic brand you have works. I'm not a big acrylic painter. Oops, sorry, but I do play with it every once in a while. I do like it because you can treat it like a watercolor as well. So let's get started on making our palette. So if you don't have a paint mixing tray, but you have a paper plate, if it's styrofoam, if you have a styrofoam plate, then you don't need the plastic wrap. But if it's paper, you're going to want to put plastic wrap. And notice I have it's a really long sheet. Let's see if you can see this. It's a really long piece of saran wrap or plastic wrap because I want to be able to touch both sides. So I want the bottom, I want them to touch on the bottom so that they can grab each other. That's what's going to help keep your plastic wrap in place. Okay, and then this way you can put your paint on here. It won't soak up the paper plate, and your mixing plate will last a little bit longer. And I'm gonna open these. So I'm just gonna put a little bit. We're gonna do an apple together. So I'm just gonna do a little bit of paint. I don't need a lot. So I have a yellow. Let's see I have a lemon yellow. This is called Indian yellow, so it's just an orange. And for the size of the apple we're going to make, this might be a little too much paint, but I'll show you how to save your paint for another painting. Or what my friends and I like to do, we like to create what's called a community canvas. So we create this very abstract painting, and we just keep adding to it each time with whatever paint we have left over. And I have a light sap green, so it's kind of a dark green. And I'll leave that for now. I also have a Mars black, I have an ultramarine blue, and I have a white. I don't like using white. I try to avoid using white because it just makes things a pastel color. It doesn't really, I don't think it does what any of us ever intend for it to do. So I'll show you some tricks to get your lighter values so that without having to use the white.